do it. We go to work, we do our job, we handle the calls, whatever it is, being a patrol officer, a detective, a dispatcher, firefighter, it doesn't matter. You get off duty and you drop into this almost like a sine wave. You drop in this depressive bottom of the roller coaster, and we disengage from resiliency factors. Spirituality, physical exercise, hobbies, socialization, all get put on the back burner.
Welcome to First Responder Fitness with Carl Wimmer, where armor is forged through mental, spiritual, and physical preparation. Welcome to First Responder Fitness with Carl Wimmer. The following interview is a two-part interview, and today is part one of the interview I conducted with Dr. Kevin Gilmartin, the author of Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. What an amazing interview. And we talk about this book that is so fantastic and is life-changing for police officers. It has been around now for several decades, and it should be required reading for all new law enforcement officers. So sit back, relax, and enjoy part one of this interview with Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. Welcome to First Responder Fitness, everybody. I am Carl Wimmer, your host, and I am extremely honored today to be interviewing at least someone in my mind, a man who is a legend in the law enforcement community. I will never forget I mentioned this in a podcast a couple episodes ago where I talk about the first really brutal youth suicide that I responded to as a new officer. And it so affected me on an emotional level. At being the first one, I'll never forget the kid's name. I'll never forget the family's name. It affected me deeply. And it was not long after that our chief handed out this book, which at the end of this episode, I'll post a link in the notes where you can purchase this book. But it was a book entitled Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. And my copy became dog-eared and highlighted, and it really became for me on a personal level, it became one of those books that really a top 5 book in my library. One that was so important to me throughout my career. Now, I retired in 2020, but this book has helped so many law enforcement officers, and I worked for an agency where every officer that came into the department was given a copy of that book. And so we're honored today to have Dr. Gilmartin, the author of that book, with us. I would like to just give you listeners just a small little background for Dr. Gilmartin, because he is not just a doctor. He is not just a person who deals in theory. He is someone who served an entire career as a law enforcement officer, which is fantastic. Dr. Gilmartin is a behavioral science consultant specializing in law enforcement. He's the author of the book I told you about, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, a guide for officers and their families. He formerly spent 20 years in law enforcement in Tucson, Arizona. During his tenure, he supervised hostage negotiation team and the behavioral sciences unit. I'm going to have to get after him in just a minute, because the hostage negotiators always ruined our fun as a SWAT team commander. Dr. Gilmartin presently maintains a consulting relationship with law enforcement agencies nationally in the United States, Canada, and Australia. He's held adjunct instructor positions at Cornell University, the University of Massachusetts, Sam Houston State University of Texas. He has served as a guest instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia for 30 years and has lectured and consulted at police agencies in Europe, North America, and Australia. He is a charter member of the International Association of Chief of Police Psychological Services Section. He holds a doctorate degree in clinical psychology from the University of Arizona and is a licensed psychologist in the state of Arizona, the Department of Justice, the FBI, the IACP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and Police Association of New South Wales have published his work. He's a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps and resides in Sun River, Oregon, and Tucson, Arizona. Dr. Gilmartin, it's a pleasure to welcome you to First Responder Fitness. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like I said in the introduction, your book really was influential to me during a really tough time during my law enforcement career, and a time where I think even in the early to mid 90s, post-traumatic stress, PTSD, all of those things were largely unknown. And in one of our conversations, you had made mention that was an unrecognized or undiagnosed thing for a very, very long time. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I am not sure exactly the date when post-traumatic stress disorder was recognized as an illness, as an injury. But I remember doing my internship at the Veterans Administration Hospital, and this was in the 70s, and this was it was part of the PhD doctoral program in clinical psychology, and that diagnosis didn't exist. There was lots and lots of veterans. They were all veterans, many Vietnam combat veterans that were clearly, now we would know they were suffering from acute post-traumatic stress disorder, but they were being treated as if they were substance abuse patients, or there really wasn't a diagnostic categorization. And since there really wasn't a mechanism to assist them, a lot of the veterans just didn't seek help. And it was really unfortunate. And there was a lot of parallels to policing at the time. There was no discussion of PTSD in public safety, in fire, or in police. That didn't even start getting talked about to the late 90s. And it wasn't until, I think, after 9/11 that we started really recognizing that this is legitimate and affects almost all people in fire and policing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I like that. You say it affects all people in both the armed services and in law enforcement, first responders in general. And I'm really glad to see a change taking place. And we're going to talk more about that, but particularly you talk about destigmatizing getting mental help. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But I have so many things I'd like to discuss regarding your book. And one of the things that really hit home to me early on and throughout my entire career, it's found in chapter 2 of your book. It's the emotional cycle of law enforcement, this honeymoon phase, and how you go through this. I'll never forget when I was a police officer, the first year I was a police officer, maybe in the first 2 years, someone would say, "Hey, how's the job going?" And I literally said these words. I said, "Man, I cannot believe they pay me to do this. I can't believe they pay me to be a police officer." Of course, that didn't.
2-year point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they go into the mature phase where you become more aware of the realities of the job and the growing stress.
Yeah.
And then the veteran stage where you experience emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and detachment from others. Has anything changed from that? I experienced that.
There's no change. It's like a river. It just flows and depends on where you get in. I can look at 2-year cops today, and they're not much different than 2-year cops 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And you look at cops that are retired today, and they're not much different. I think the one thing we have today that we never had before is we have an awareness that wellness is important, that wellness is critical. That never existed before. And you would just suck it up for the last 10 years of your career, get through it. And you have this light at the end of the tunnel called retirement. And you're just answering your calls, trying to do your job, getting through the day so you can get the heck out of there when you retire. And it's a shame because so many people's lives get destroyed by a policing career. They really do.
And no question about it. No question about it. There's a reason. I feel very fortunate myself, having a very prosperous, thriving marriage, going on, I think, 27 years here real soon. And I feel very fortunate about that. But so many of my colleagues, just the dysfunction in the family, the dysfunction at home, um, the dysfunction just within the marriage. And I think a lot of that comes back to this what you call hyper awareness or hyper vigilance.
Hypervigilance.
Yeah,
That's the key. It really
yeah,
is. The biggest psychological injury to a police officer is officer safety. That sounds ironic, but it really is. It's
wow,
if you are a good cop, that mean and a good firefighter also, but I'll have to speak from the cop perspective. If you're a good cop, you see the world differently than other people see the world. You don't see the same world that they do, and you don't look at the world the same way other people do. If you think of what officer safety is, it's walking into a situation and having this very highly elevated level of alertness and being cognizant of what can go wrong at that situation.
yeah,
Most people think with what I call probability decision making. I use probability decision making. I have to get to the airport. How long will it probably take me to get to the airport? Um, I have to go to a city. I have to look at the weather. I probably should bring a heavy coat. Traffic is going to be bad, so I should probably leave 20 extra minutes. Everything normal people do is based on probability thinking. If you use normal thinking as a police officer, that would get you killed. You'd say, well, there's probably not a gun in this car. I probably don't need to wear a ballistic body armor tonight because I'm probably not going to get shot. I don't even need to bring a weapon with me because I'm probably not going to be in an officer involved shooting. So what from the very beginning of a law enforcement career, you realize normal probability based thinking is inappropriate and you start doing possibility thinking. Everything you look at from the worst case scenario. You knock on a door and you step to the left or the right, not because a round is probably going to come through the door, because one's possibly going to come through the door. And the FTOs have to teach this to the recruits. They learn it at the academy. But by the time you've got 2 years on as a cop, it's in your DNA. You look at everything. It dictates every aspect of your body, how you walk up on cars, where you position yourself. And when you start losing officer safety, you increase the risks of your being injured. But as you enhance your officer safety, you see the world from a very altered filter. Your lens is a lens of distrust. And that's what cynicism is. It's viewing humans from a distrust-based perspective. So, if you're a cop 10 years, you walk up in a car and you trust there's not a gun in the car, that will work for you until there is a gun in the car. Then you'll have no skill set to survive it. So we teach this pathological way of thinking called officer safety, which you have to do. You have to have street survival skills for this job. But if you have street survival skills, we have to teach emotional survival skills to balance that and to have the person have insight into what's going on in their life. If we don't do that, we end up injuring the officer. And I don't just mean injuring them psychologically. We increase their risks of sleep disorder, of type 2 diabetes, of heart disease, premature death syndromes. And it all rolls back to what you have to do as a cop. It's not just the things that you have to see as a cop, it's how you have to look at things. And when you start looking at the whole world that way, it becomes very isolating, very alienating, and it also disrupts relationships, intimate relationships, marriages, friendships. They can be destroyed by the policing experience. But we have to teach it. We have to teach street survival. We're an armed society, and so.
yep.
Uh,
I got to tell you that is, I've probably read that. I mean, I've been to your website and fascinating articles for anyone who hasn't been there. I believe it isn't it emotionalsurvival.com. Is that your website?
Emotionalsurvival.com. Well, you might have read it, but you definitely lived it. So, I mean, and
right.
that's the issue.
But you talking about it just hit home to me. It just blew my mind. He's mentioning that officer survival is one of the we have to have it, but it's damaging.
It's the first psychological injury. We talk about post-traumatic stress disorder as if it stands alone. No, officer safety, we have to teach it. Street survival, we have to teach it. We have to master it. But we have to balance it. We cannot just have officer safety, because if we do, every day we leave the policing role, we'll have an inadequate way of socially interacting with anyone. And
yes,
this hypervigilance that you gave reference to, that's an elevated level of alertness. If there's one thing cops and paramedics and firefighters and dispatchers have to have, it's elevated alertness when they're doing their job. They can't do their job on autopilot. They're aware of every input that's around their environment, because any one of them can be potentially lethal. So you push the brain into this elevated level of alertness, which is biological. That we engage the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. The person's elevated in sympathetic innervation, cortisol is elevated, quick reflexes, quick alertness, perceptive of what's going on. Now, that enhances at an intense call, but it's always on a moderately elevated level all the time. Just watching a police officer on patrol, their eyes are moving back and forth, their elevated alertness. The average civilian drives down the street and they just look at what's in front of them, or maybe at the traffic light. The cop is moving their head to the left and right and seeing what's transpiring. That's the damage. That's the hardest thing to convince people. That's the injury, because that elevated level of alertness when you get off duty has a homeostatic reaction. The pendulum swings backwards and the cop drops into this exhausted, depressive-like state where they feel like doing nothing. And then they do nothing. So they'll sit and they withdraw from social encounters. I don't feel, I'm dragging, I'm just going to kick back tonight and chill. And so they stop having those social encounters, and the investment socially and emotionally is with other police officers. So they become very, very good at their job, but they're not quite so good at being a bowler anymore. They're not quite so good at hitting the gym anymore. Their church attendance kind of pulls back. And this takes about a decade before the full damage is done, but it's going to be very damaging. I've seen decades of police families destroyed by it.
I think that as I am listening to you, I think I inadvertently quoted you or referenced you without giving credit, because I wasn't sure where I had heard it. But now, as I hear you mentioning, I had talked about the fact that police officers at some point in the first 10 years of their career, a large number of them, if they were regular church attenders, stopped attending church because they stopped having anything in common with the people that they're surrounded with, and they couldn't relate to them, and they didn't trust them in the back of their mind.
Well, yes, that takes place, but a lot of it also starts with just a sense of exhaustion. I don't feel like going back out tonight. Mom and dad invited us over for a barbecue, but you know what, honey, I'm just going to kick back and chill tonight. I don't feel like going back out. I'm dragging butt, and I'm just going to watch the ball game tonight. And yeah, I know I should go to the gym, but you know what? I'm just dragging. I'm just going to chill. So officer safety and doing the job right, the way we do it, we go to work, we do our job, we handle the calls, whatever it is, being a patrol officer, a detective, a dispatcher, firefighter, it doesn't matter. You get off duty and you drop into this almost like a sine wave. You drop in this depressive bottom of the roller coaster, and we disengage from resiliency factors. Spirituality, physical exercise, hobbies, socialization, all get put on the back burner. But being a cop is intense. So it becomes almost recreational like in the first 10 years. You love going to work. It's not hard to get a young cop to come to work. It's hard to get them to go home because they pull back. And in the first 10 years, there's about a 50% reduction in church attendance and voluntary physical exercise. Now, this data is changing because of there's some generational changes in policing. Our cops are finally starting to take better care of themselves. We see a reduction in smoking, we see a reduction in caffeine intake, and an uptick in voluntary exercise. But it's still a long way to go.
That is such good information, and I just a little bit of clarification or explanation. So, because the officer, when on duty, is on such a high alert, and perhaps they've been in a high speed pursuit, they've been in perhaps they had somebody resist arrest, their sympathetic nervous system takes over the fight or flight, and police officers, you're not going to flee unless it's really bad. When you get home, is it more mental, or is there actually a physiological mechanism that causes the body? You were enhanced, you were super enhanced, and now there's a physiological equal opposite reaction, and
Absolutely.
It depresses you.
Well, you see, your question, the way you formed that question is excellent, but it points out one of the mistakes we make in how we view the world. We have this whole idea that here's body, here's mind, and they're two entirely separate entities. Well,
right.
That comes from the Middle Ages, our way of trying to balance religion and, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and, but we know now, neurosciences particularly, have enhanced so much that the difference between physical and mental, they're the same. They're the exact same. And they're not any different. And when you look at depression, we would always think depression was a state of sadness. Well, depression, no, it's a neurotransmitter imbalance. It's a biological medical condition that has to have interventions to it, typically medical interventions or biological interventions. The simplest one is exercise, by the way. But when we're looking at this whole physiological change, policing requires you to be above average in alertness. So, if you want to tie that back to PTSD, the PTSD, one of the early definitions was exposure to an event outside the normal range of human occurrence, things that people don't normally see. Well, if it was normal, they wouldn't call the cops to begin with. If it was normal, they wouldn't call the firefighters to begin with. So everything that starts with 911, by definition, is abnormal.
It's abnormal.
Yeah, and it doesn't require a high-speed chase with shots fired, because the vast majority of policing doesn't involve high-speed chases with shots fired. It's just going to work, having to put your brain into that elevated level of alertness, and then think of a pendulum. We swing the pendulum high at work for alertness. We get off duty, it swings into the opposite field, from high sympathetic to profound parasympathetic. And it's not what happens at work that injures our officers. It's what stops happening after work, where they disengage, they stop exercising, they stop going to church, they stop fishing, they stop riding their mountain bike. And all of these things, the only aspect of their life is the abnormal part that you deal with when you go to work. You go to work to serve and protect, but you're dealing with aberrant behavior the entire time you're there. It's and we start getting very judgmental about things like that. I've used this mindless word association test forever. I'll put the word scout leader up, and I'll ask the cops what they think of it. What comes to your mind with scout leader? Pedophile, sex offender, child molester, pervert, and it just that's the response, because that's the world of reality. And even cops who are scout leaders will say they became a scout leader because they didn't want their kids unmonitored in that context. So but that cynical, sarcastic way of viewing the world, it works. It's, the guy's lying because his lips are moving. Well, that's probably fine when you're interrogating somebody, but then you go home and you use that same mindset on your family, on your children, on your spouse, and it's very alienating. It's very disengaging. And I find getting the police officer who can make the transition from possibility thinking, always thinking the worst at work, to probability thinking off duty, and just, well, let's go for a picnic, let's go let's go camping, and all those other, I don't know, that half of the cops don't see half the world. They don't see 97% of the world. They become experts at their subject matter, and their subject matter by definition is aberrant. Firefighters are a little different. Firefighters with firefighter. I'm sure some of your listeners are firefighters, but firefighters deal with traumatic events. And the rest of the time, they're not doing anything. I hate to say that about firefighters, but their shifts are more humane. They put more emphasis on nutrition. They put more emphasis on fitness, and their schedules permit them big chunks of time off to have a life.
Yes.
Firefighters supplement their income by doing side jobs in some other area. They're landscapers, they're carpenters, they lay carpet, they do electrical work. Yep. Cops, to supplement their income, work overtime as a cop. So that's right. A 25-year cop is real good at being a cop, but they're maybe not such a good Little League coach anymore. They're maybe not such a good elk hunter anymore. And that's why with cops, you start seeing cops in their 30s talking about what they're going to do when they retire, because they see this panacea called retirement. Then there's going to be nobody screwing with them. They're going to be able to go play golf 5 days a week and go fly fishing and ride their mountain bike. And what they don't get through their head is they can do all those things right now. They can do them right now, but it requires them to step out of their cop physiology, out of that cop elevated sympathetic branch of their autonomic nervous system, and then engage. And the way to make that transition actually is through an exercise episode almost every day after work. I mean, that makes the transition easier. And we don't, only recently has the field of mental health and police started grasping that. We haven't. We're missing.
Now you're hitting right on the area that I am so deeply passionate about, which is physical fitness. Physical fitness is mental fitness, and
yes, it is.
The fact that I think that there have been I want to say numerous. I can't confirm numerous, but there have definitely been studies that show that vigorous physical activity is as effective in many people as antidepressant medication.
Well, there was a series of studies done on that at Duke University called their SMILE research, and there was 3 categories. One, these were depressed patients that were seen at their psychiatric service. One group was given antidepressant medication. The second group was given antidepressant medication plus psychotherapy. And the third group walked on a treadmill for 20 minutes a day briskly. 4-month follow-up, I believe, all equally had treated their depression. So, and we're not talking about extreme exercise either. We're talking about moderate exercise. Right. And it was as effective as antidepressant medication. I'm going to plug a book here for just a second.
Please do.
It's not my book, but the book Spark. The book Spark by John Ratey, a Harvard psychiatrist. The whole premise of this book is the impact of exercise on mental health. And it's astounding because we get in the rut of doing the things that we do. We get in our own silo. And, psychologists do counseling, and PE teachers do exercise. And we're in our silo, they're in their silo, and There's nothing I do that affects them. There's nothing they do that affects us. And every so often, there's something happens where we say, well, wait a second. Why has this thing gotten better? Why did this patient get better? And when they start looking at it, they realized they enhanced their exercise. They started walking, half hour every day. And pretty soon, a year and a half later, that officer's depression is not only gone, they've lost 30 pounds. And now they're physicians getting them off type 2 diabetes medication and
high blood pressure medication, right?
Yeah, the biggest tragedy to me in law enforcement is not that we have the elevated rates of disease, elevated rates of suicide and post-traumatic stress disorder, but that we start with a mentally healthy, physically fit, psychologically screened population. I know of no other population that has to undergo psychological testing and physical testing and interviews. So we know these are not mentally ill people when they start the journey. They're healthy, they're outgoing, they're bright. And then we put them through this process. Part of it's cultural, but part of it is that we don't appreciate that the changes are so simple to do. I've been studying one group of police officers for 50 plus years, the same group, and been following them for these decades, for 50 plus years. And,
wow.
and when I say following them, I mean, I've known them, I've psychologically tested them, I've dealt with them over these years, and they're good men and women. They're very good men and women. A lot of them are dear friends, but they have paid the price for this career. And some of them have diseases that we could have prevented if at the end of each shift, every cop would have 20 minutes in the gym as part of their contract, or even voluntarily, but should be part of their contract. We would reduce type 2 diabetes between 60 and 70% in that population. With 22 minutes a day of moderate exercise reduces the biggest disease killer of our police, type 2 diabetes, which slides into heart disease and stroke at elevated rates. We can turn that back by, for Hispanic, Native American, and African American officers, which have a higher risk factor, by 60%, and the general population by 70%, and we don't do it.
It's absurd.
It's
absolutely absurd.
It's absurd.
You say this in the book, and I think it's very powerful, and it's so simple, but it's so simple that I think that people, I don't know, police agencies sometimes don't grasp it. You say this, quote, "The best coping mechanism is proactive care." So too many times we wait until someone is suffering before we do anything. But you go on and say, being proactive in managing your stress before it leads to emotional or psychological breakdowns. So proactive care, exercise being preeminent, perhaps above everything else. And I could not agree with you more. When I was SWAT team commander, our law enforcement agency, at least for the SWAT guys for a period of time only, they gave us the ability to work out on duty. They allowed us an hour every day, either before shift or after shift, to work out. And that soon morphed into where they saw the benefits. And so every patrol person, everyone that worked there, if a call load, of course, pending the call load. If you had priority one calls holding, you're not going to go work out. But in most cases, you could find an hour throughout your shift, before, during, or after the shift, where you could go spend an hour in the gym. And years later, I went to another even larger police department, and they did not have that. And so I petitioned upper management, and they were very open to it. And even though this was a bigger, busier, perhaps the busiest police department in my state, they still allowed it. They permitted officers to have an hour before, an hour after, or during their shift, as long as calls permitted.
Well, that's insightful leadership. I think if I was one of the bean counters there, I would cut it back to 22 minutes, not an hour, except for like the SWAT guys. But I'm not trying to be sarcastic about that. An hour is just great. But it isn't just so you can run down the bad guy, jump the building, and have dynamic strength to put the handcuff. Those are all very, very necessary. It's to remove the police officer from that depressive after action mindset where they just don't want to talk. They want to be left alone, and how destructive that becomes. And it's so simple. I was working with one police department where we had management and the union together. We were talking about the impact of exercise. I said, well, the solid research shows 150 minutes a week of moderate exercise. That's the Center for Disease Control gives you that number.
American Heart Association, 150 minutes of moderate cardiovascular exercise per week. Yeah.
And unless my math is wrong, it's come to 22 minutes a day. And they decided, the union proposed this to the city. They said, well, our officers will voluntarily do 11 minutes at the end of each shift in the gym if the city will pay for the first 11 minutes. If they met 50-50, that'll give us our 22 minutes. And they signed off as part of a contractual agreement, and they got their 22 minutes, except the city got the better half of the deal because the average exercise period lasted 45 minutes. All the city had to do was prime the pump with that 11 minutes. And the cops were not saying, well, my 11 minutes are up, I go. They got into it, whether they were doing CrossFit or whether they were doing just weights or they were on the cardio. They had fitness coordinators, certain people who have a propensity toward learning more about physical fitness. They became kind of the leaders in running weight teams and cardio groups and group runs. And it changes cultures. It just does, and saves lives, actually.
It changes cultures from the stereotypical donut eating, out of shape officer culture to a culture of health and fitness, and just healthiness, just overall well-being. Absolutely. I don't know if there are any statistics on this. And I've been meaning to really dig into the weeds about this, but I would be willing to bet that those agencies that allow for that, that allow even 22 minutes a day, half an hour a day, that not only allow it, but actually kind of not mandatory, but almost mandatory exercise for their officers. I'd be curious as to how it affects mental health days off, injuries in the line of duty, injuries off duty, how it affects the overall budget of the police department. Because, if an officer calls in sick and they're not sick, they just mentally, they can't do it that day. Or if your department allows mental health days and you take a day off, I think in the long run, giving an officer a half an hour of paid exercise 5 years later, I think I would suspect that it would pay dividends.
Well, I would suspect also, and I'm sure there are researchers that are doing that and looking at that. I was doing an in-service training at a large police department, and I would be picked up every morning at my hotel by a police officer in a patrol car. It would drive me to the police academy. And I would have the same conversation. I would say, are you assigned to the academy? He said, no, I'm on light duty for a back injury. I said, oh, what kind of a back injury? He's a lower back injury. They're talking about I might have to have surgery on my lower back. 5 days in a row, 5 different officers, all were on light duty for lower back injury. And I asked the officers, I said, how much training do you have in the prevention of back injury? He said, it was like I asked him, what's the oxygen level on Mars? He said, none. I said, so this week, your department, I've had 5 officers out on lower back injuries. which could be a very clearly a career-ending injury.
Yeah.
And there was no training on wellness or fitness or physical therapy on, well, you're sitting in a patrol car with a heavy duty belt, and then you jump out of that patrol car and you have to engage in a pretty active behavior. You don't think you're going to risk herniating a disc. But there was, and I'm watching it, and what sticks in my mind about this is I was watching a bunch of steel workers building a bridge in Portland, Oregon. And I'm right there as the steel workers are coming on the job site about 7 a.m. And these steel workers form a big circle. Some of these are big boys, Yeah. And they're sitting there, and they start playing music, and they do basically the hokey pokey. They shake their right leg, they shake their left leg, they bend over, they sidestep to the left, sidestep to the right, touch their toes, stand up, twist, 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 and it looked ridiculous. But I walked up to him afterwards. I said, "Do you guys do this every morning?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Why?" He goes, "How would you like to have a cramp, 8 stories up in the air here over a river as you're building a bridge?" He said, "We have to have flexibility. We have to have dynamic strength. We're doing jobs that require that. And so you have to prepare for it." And so we take some person, we put him in a patrol car, we strap a duty belt on him, which has their weapon, which has magazines, which has handcuffs, and we put him out, and we don't teach them that there's just a few simple exercises that you can do in a patrol car by moving your legs certain ways 5-10 times a day that flexes, increases the ability to have a more relaxed musculature, and you're probably not going to pull a muscle or strain a disc. But we don't do that. You just hire them, tire them, and fire them, kind of thing, And it's a shame because you have, it's simple stuff.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that first section, that first portion of our interview with Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. As you can tell, he is vastly knowledgeable and knows the ins and outs of law enforcement, having been and served a career as a law enforcement officer, as a first responder. His holistic approach to health, his holistic approach to mental and physical health and connecting the two, and his priority of physical fitness is such a breath of fresh air. I hope you enjoyed that. Again, subscribe to our channel, click the bell button, and watch for future episodes. Thank you for watching. Until next time, be good to yourself, be good to others, and as always, stay safe.